Thanks for tuning in. Sorry I couldn't be in class today. Today I want to talk about two things. First, I want to review Hobbes's ideas about the state of nature, and then I'll move on to talk about his ideas about the laws of nature. So the first thing to understand about the state of nature is just what he means by state. That is, we don't want to be confused and think that Hobbes is talking about the government of nature. Instead, he's using state to just refer to the circumstances or the condition of nature. What is the situation that all men are in before they have any kind of institutions, in particular before they have any political authority. And so Hobbes thinks that everyone is equal in the state of nature because no one is subject to anyone else's authority. No one else has to do what anyone else tells them to do. And this is related to a second sense in which everyone is equal for Hobbes, which is that everyone poses a roughly equal threat to everyone else. Everyone is more or less equal in the faculties of body and mind, such that no one is such that they don't have to fear anyone else. That is, everyone has reason to fear others. And so that makes us all roughly equal. Now you might think that because we are equal, that was a good thing. Today we hear all the time people talking about what a bad thing inequality is. But in fact, Hobbes thinks that the equality of the state of nature is a very bad thing, this very radical, anarchistic equality. From this kind of equality, according to Hobbes, proceeds war. And there are three kinds of motives in particular that lead to conflict. The first is competition. People's desires are naturally unlimited, and so they naturally come into conflict over scarce resources. So we fight because of scarcity. Another reason we come into conflict is because of what Hobbes calls diffidence, that is, fear. So diffidence is just the opposite of confidence. So people fight because they fear that their neighbors will attack them first. That is, they launch preemptive strikes. And in particular, I'm going to fear my neighbor both because I think he might want what I already possess, and also because I recognize that he might fear me. And so he's going to launch a preemptive strike against me so that I don't attack him. So the rational thing for me to do is to attack him before he can launch that preemptive strike. So you see here the nasty logic of insecurity that Hobbes is describing. In fact, these kinds of ideas became very influential in the 20th century when people were analyzing the strategy of conflict, in particular the strategy between world powers, so between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, for example. Why is it that they might get into a war without anyone really wanting to get into a war, but nonetheless they're both so fearful of the other that they might be inclined to attack first? So those are the first two motives, competition and diffidence or fear. The third is glory. People fight because they really don't like equality that much, and they want to elevate themselves above others. And so this just gives everyone else a further thing to fear. Not only do I have to worry that you're going to attack me because you want what I have or because you fear me, but you might also just want the glory of having conquered me and to dominate me. And so this is just yet another thing for me to fear. So the state of nature, according to Hobbes, is a state of war. Even when there's no actual fighting, there's going to be an inclination to fight. People are going to be on their guard against conflict and war in the state of nature. And so this culminates in chapter 13 in Hobbes's famous description of the state of nature when he tells us that in the state of nature the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So a couple of those adjectives are really worth singling out. So the life of man in the state of nature is solitary because there's not enough confidence to build up communities. We don't have enough trust to have communities, to live in communities. Also, this life in the state of nature is poor because nobody has enough trust in his neighbor for him to think it's a good idea to actually invest in creating anything. So you're not going to spend your time plowing your field if you think that your neighbor is just going to come and take all your crops from you. And so the life in the state of nature is poor as well as solitary, and then it's nasty, brutish, and short, of course, because of the constant conflict, the constant war between individuals. So the state of nature is not a very nice place to be, and so Hobbes thinks we're naturally inclined to get ourselves out of the state of nature if we possibly can. And there are a couple of main passions, a couple of main kinds of desires that induce us to try to leave the state of nature. So the most obvious of these are the fear of death and the desire for nice things. As he puts it, the desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living and the hope to attain these things. So avoiding death and desire of luxuries or anything that's just going to make life more than solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short is going to motivate you to try to get out of this state of anarchy. And so Hobbes tells us that reason suggesteth convenient articles of peace upon which men may be drawn to agreement. These are the laws of nature. So the laws of nature are rational precepts that allow us to live in peace. And so that's what we'll be looking at in just a moment. So just to review then some of the main themes of this kind of reviewing that first lecture about Hobbes. First, Hobbes is a subjectivist about the good, whereas Aristotle thinks of politics as being the application of our ideas about what is good. That is, we have ideas about what the good life is, what a good community is, and we're trying to implement those things in politics. Hobbes is more skeptical about those. He thinks good is just a word we use to describe what we want, and people want different things. And so that makes him a subjectivist about the good. He doesn't think there is one kind of objective good. Second, he thinks that human wants are unlimited. So unlike Aristotle, who thought that there were limits on what you needed to live a good life, the good life is bounded in certain ways. For Hobbes, there's always a desire to have more and more riches, more and more power. And so these kind of facts about human nature make it such that the state of nature is a state of war. And so importantly here, Hobbes' view of nature is more modern than ours, whereas Aristotle thinks of what is natural as this end state, this goal or aim towards which things are striving or developing. Hobbes thinks of nature in this more modern way as the way human beings are before they have artifacts or institutions, before they've created things. And so the state of nature, he tells us, is, it's kind of by definition an anarchy. By definition, it's a state where there's no authority, there are no institutions, and as it turns out, he wants to persuade you this state of nature is going to be a state of war. Now I want to turn to the main subject of today's lecture, which is Hobbes' ideas about the law of nature. So a bit of background first. Where is this notion of law of nature or natural law coming from? Well, the most important developer of this idea of natural law is Thomas Aquinas. So he lives from 1225 to 1274. And he is drawing from Aristotle. Aristotle's ideas are new at the time to Latin Christendom. And so Aquinas is taking certain Aristotelian ideas and synthesizing them with Christianity. So he has a discussion about what is the definition of law in general. And so he thinks that the definition of a law, what do we mean when we talk about law? He He says a law is an ordinance of reason. It exists for the common good. It's made by him who has care of the community, by some kind of authority figure, and it's something that is promulgated. So the law is something that is made known to those who are subject to the law. So this description of law should sound somewhat familiar, as it's certainly drawing from Aristotle's way of thinking about law, especially as you find in the very last chapter of Aristotle's Ethics. So what is the natural law? Well, the natural law is an ordinance of reason. It's for the common good, not just of a particular community or of a particular country, but instead for all human beings. And the natural law is made by God because he's the one who has care for all human beings. And how is it promulgated? It's promulgated not by revelation, or not solely by revelation. It's knowable by reason. And so that's what Aquinas and scholastic thinkers meant by natural law. The law that God has instituted, that is the moral law that God has instituted for human beings, which is knowable by the natural light of reason. You don't need revelation to know what the natural law is, or to know what the moral law is. So again, basically what Aquinas has done here is he's synthesized a Christian picture of God's law that's familiar from the Bible with an Aristotelian conception of what law and justice consist in. So the way that Aquinas thought about the natural law as respect its content, he says the first precept of the natural law is that good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. So that might not sound that enlightening, it might sound like a kind of tautology, but what Aquinas wants to argue is that there are going to be certain goods, there's certain things, and we're going to identify these as basic human goods, and our activity, our lives ought to be directed towards pursuing those good things, and evil is whatever is contrary to those basic goods. So what are the kinds of goods that Aquinas has in mind? He's thinking about self-preservation, the life and reproduction of the species, life in society, and theoretical, practical, and religious knowledge. So all of these things are good. How do we know they're good? Aquinas thinks that we have natural inclinations to these things, and so by observing what we have a natural inclination for, we have an idea as to what the basic human goods are. So I don't want to try to say a lot to defend Thomas Aquinas' views here. I'm really just offering them for you as background. In fact, there are passages in the Kant Anthology where Aquinas discusses natural law, if you want to take a look at those. An important idea of natural law theory, in fact, part of the whole point of it, is to explain the relationship between human law and natural law. And so the idea is that human law is only ultimately authoritative if it's consistent with the natural law. So let me just pick something like life in society. So the basis of a lot of ethics and politics is making life in society possible. And if laws are passed by the sovereign that are contrary to those kinds of goods, then they aren't really legitimate laws. They aren't really authoritative laws. Let me give you another example. One of the goods is religious knowledge. So if there was a law that prevented you from attaining religious knowledge, laws that prevented you from studying the true faith, as Aquinas would have thought about it, then that's not a legitimate law. That's not an authoritative law because it's not consistent with the natural law. The human law is only has authority, that is, it only commands our obedience if it's follows from or is consistent with the natural law. So let's bring this back to Hobbes. If the if natural law theory in the hands of someone like Thomas Aquinas is about pursuing what is good, and these goods are these kind of substantive, objective goods, you might think that, well, Hobbes isn't going to be at all sympathetic to natural law theory because we've seen he's more of a subjectivist about the good. Good is what people call the objects of their appetites. But in fact, Hobbes wants to reinvent natural law theory for the modern world. So Hobbes thinks these Aristotelian notions about objective good are unsustainable, that we can't, those are indefensible, but there is going to still be a way of explaining what the law of nature is, or to put it another way, we can still work out a moral law that exists, that's knowable by reason, but it's going to look somewhat different than the kind of natural law that was developed by someone like Aquinas. So the first thing that Hobbes does is he distinguishes two things that the old natural law theorists did not tend to distinguish. He wants to distinguish between the right of nature and the law of nature. So the right of nature is the liberty that each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature. So this is at the very beginning of chapter 14. So the right of nature is a liberty. It's a permission. Everyone in the state of nature is permitted to use whatever powers or faculties he has in whatever way he needs to preserve his own nature. So that includes, doing anything that I feel I need to do to other people. So if I need to kill others to preserve my own life, then I may do so. If I need to, in other ways, harm others or steal from others, all of those things I'm permitted to do in the state of nature. There are no, so one has a permission in the state of nature to do whatever you need to do to preserve your own life. So Hobbes, importantly, thinks of liberty in a negative way. So this, as political philosophy kind of goes forward from Hobbes, starts becoming an important distinction between negative liberty and positive liberty. So we'll talk about more positive conceptions of liberty a little bit later on, but Hobbes has a very negative conception of liberty. In fact, he tends to be one of the exemplars of a negative conception of liberty. Liberty is the absence of external impediments. So if there's not something that is impeding you from doing what you want to do, then you have liberty, then you are free. Another way people sometimes put it is, on this conception of freedom, you are free when you have freedom from certain things. So that's the right of nature. So what is the law of nature? A law of nature is a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, or taketh away the means of preserving the same, and to omit that by which he thinketh it may be best preserved. So, in other words, the law of nature are what we might think of as rules or counsels of prudence. What you ought to do if you don't want to get yourself killed. If you want to preserve your life, here's what you ought to do. So at this point, a comparison to the Thomist view is profitable. For Thomas Aquinas, self-preservation is one good. It is a basic good. He thinks all living things are concerned with their own preservation. But it's not the only good. It's just, therefore, one part of the law of nature. That is, on the Thomistic view, the laws of nature also promote the welfare of the individual as a part of the community, as part of the common good. So all of those other goods fall out for Hobbes. And they fall out because he thinks, again, people have different desires. Some people like theology, some people don't. Some people like science, some people don't. So those are matters of taste. Well, what about self-preservation? I suppose that the best way of thinking about what Hobbes's view here is that that too is subjective in a way. I mean, it's just a matter of taste that we happen to like to live, but it so happens that it's a more or less universal taste. I mean, maybe you're going to find the rare exceptions, but from a political point of view, everyone wants to live. And so even though there's no objective goods in the sense of these are the things that everyone ought to um, the things that everyone ought to pursue, the goods everyone ought to promote, there is this particular object which everyone wants, that is their own preservation. And so that provides a bedrock for Hobbes to start working out his political philosophy. This is the good from which all political theory is going to arise from, this idea that we all are concerned about our own preservation. Hobbes sums all this up in what he calls the fundamental law of nature. So the fundamental law of nature is that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he hath hope of obtaining it. And then he continues with what he calls the sum of the right of nature, and when he cannot obtain it, he may seek and use all of the helps and advantages of war. So the fundamental law of nature says seek peace. The best way to live a long, comfortable life is to get yourself out of the state of war, get yourself into the state of peace. But if you can't get yourself into the state of peace, then you're perfectly permitted to use all of the helps and advantages of war. So you can attack others, steal from others, do what you need to do to attain power, if that's the best way of providing yourself security. So Hobbes tells us that from this fundamental law of nature is derived a second law. And this law is, the second law is that if others are willing to give up their unlimited right to all things, you ought to give up your unlimited right to all things as well. And all parties ought to be contented with the same amount of liberty. Everyone ought to be contented with equal rights, equal freedoms. And so this is the way in which we're going to achieve peace, Hobbes thinks, is the best way of achieving peace is we've got to get rid of the original right of nature, this original right that says you're permitted to do whatever you want, whatever you feel you need to do to secure your own life. That has to be limited, and so we agree to give up this right to all things and have only those rights and liberties which we agree to and which are equal to everyone else. So everyone agrees to possess equal limited rights. And so this, of course, is a contract. So this is the beginning, as it were, of social contract theory for Hobbes, is this idea that the way to achieve peace is to lay down this unlimited right to all things. So the third law of nature is, follows closely behind that, which is that people have to perform their covenants. That is, you have to keep your promises. So if you have relinquished or transferred a right, then you are morally obliged to follow through with what you promised to do. So injury and injustice for Hobbes consist in going back on one's promises, in acting contrary to one's self-imposed obligations. So an injury or an injustice is to act without right, sine jure. And so injustice is like a kind of absurdity. I promised you that I was going to be content with these limited rights, but then I've gone ahead and stolen from you, acted contrary to what my agreement is. So that's the very definition of injustice, is acting contrary to one's word. It's like a kind of logical contradiction. So this means for Hobbes there's no such thing as natural injustice. Injustice is always the product of agreements. It's only by a social contract that right and wrong, just and unjust is created. And so then Hobbes goes on in chapter 15 to discuss other laws of nature. And we don't have to be too concerned about the details of these laws of nature, but it's worthwhile just taking a look at the kinds of things he includes here. They include things like gratitude, humility, equity, the use of mediators when you have a conflict that is an impartial third party. So the point of all of these laws, according to Hobbes, is that they're ways of preserving, facilitating peace when people live in multitudes. So, for example, gratitude. If someone's done a favor to you, then you ought to show gratitude. Hobbes thinks if you don't do that, people are going to take umbrage, and that's a possible source of conflict. So it's good for people to show gratitude because that tends to preserve peace and tranquility. Similarly, if you get into a fight with someone, if you get into an argument about who owns what, don't try to sort it out between yourselves. Find some mediator of some sort, some unrelated third party. That's a good way. That's an important way of preserving the peace. And so Hobbes tells us in chapter 15 that all of the laws of nature, he says, have been contracted into one easy sum, intelligible even to the meanest capacity, that is, even to the person of the least capacity, or to the simplest person. And so what that sum is this: do not that to another which thou wouldest not have done to thyself. So it's simply a negative version of the golden rule. So don't do to someone else what you don't want them to do to you. That, Hobbes thinks, is the summation of all of the law of nature. And so it's important to see what Hobbes has done here. He's taken what's a kind of common sense morality for his time. He's taken certain parts of traditional European Christian morality, and he's given it a totally new basis. Instead of basing it on divine revelation, the way traditional religion tended to do it, traditional Christianity, or instead of basing it in the way that Thomas Aquinas did, on natural law, trying to explain how there are these human goods which are knowable by reason, and then explaining how the moral law is about promoting these objective goods, so this very Aristotelian picture. Instead of doing any of those things, Hobbes is trying to explain how something that looks a lot like common sense morality, at least in his time, can be based on individual prudence. So you ought to follow these rules because they're going to create the conditions necessary for peace, and the conditions necessary for peace are necessary for you to get out of the state of nature where your life is in danger and there's no prospect for developing any of the comforts or luxuries in life. So morality for Hobbes is a system of rules created by agreement or by contract that exists for mutual advantage. So that's the heart of the Hobbesian picture of morality. And it's had its contemporary defenders, the most well-known of whom is David Gautier's book, Morals by Agreement. And he defends this kind of picture, that the way to think about rational morality, how is morality based on reason, it's because these rules are such that they are to everyone's advantage, and so they are the subject of agreement, or would be subject to a rational agreement. So this is an important kind of research program. It's an important picture of what social morality really is. But it also raises an interesting question, which is, under what condition are our agreements valid? When are we really bound to do what we said we were going to do? And this question starts leading to the problem for which the state is going to be the solution. Because notice, with respect to everything we've said so far, there's been no mention of the state. What we have so far is a kind of ideal anarchic utopia. That is, there's still no true authority. No one has power over anyone else. Instead, we have bilateral agreements. And these bilateral agreements specify what rights and duties everyone has. And what we're going to look at now is a certain problem in that system that Hobbes identifies, and he thinks the only solution to that problem is the state, is a common power or authority. So when are contracts valid? Contracts, Hobbes tells us, are only valid when each party can be assured that the other party will perform its side of the bargain. The problem is that generally one lacks this assurance in the absence of some common power over both parties to enforce contracts. So I might make an agreement with you in the state of nature, but that means that if I can't really be sure that you're going to fulfill your side of the bargain, and there's no enforcer, there's no one who I know is going to hold you accountable if you double-cross me, then I'd be kind of a sucker to do my part first if I don't know whether or not you're going to do your part. And so without assurance, Hobbes tells us that contracts aren't really binding. So generally, in the state of nature, contracts are void, at least prior to one side performing its side of the bargain. Now, if for some reason I've been, really naive or nice and already done my part, and you have no reason to fear that I'm not going to do my part of the bargain, then you're bound to fulfill your side of the bargain. But as it happens, it's often the case that the first party is worried about, is the other party going to perform their side of the bargain? So in the state of nature, contracts are generally void. So if you look at the lecture slides, I've got a little picture to try to illustrate what's going on. You imagine two desperados in the Old West who've got each other at gunpoint, and what they actually both want to do is de-escalate. So one of them says, "So we agreed on peace, why don't you drop your gun?" And the other desperado says, "I will, just as soon as you do." And so both want to lay down their weapons, but no one wants to be the first one to lay down their weapon. No one wants to be the first one to do it. So that's the dilemma of the state of nature. That's the problem of the state of nature, is that even though all parties have a reason to seek peace, no one wants to be a sucker. No one wants to put themselves in a vulnerable situation where they don't know whether the other party is going to act in a way is going to act likewise, or whether they're going to try to take advantage of them. So that, as we'll see later on, is the reason why none of the laws of nature really come into efficacy, or really have their authoritative character without a state. So at the end of chapter 15, Hobbes discusses the moral status of the laws of nature. So he says, on the one hand, the laws of nature are immutable and eternal. So Hobbes is not a relativist in any kind of deep way. He thinks, look, we can figure out by reason what sort of rules are conducive to peace in human communities. Those rules that are conducive to peace, those are the laws of nature. They're at least at a certain basic level, those rules are going to be pretty much the same everywhere. And he tells us that the laws of nature oblige he uses this Latin phrase, in foro interno, that is, they bind a desire they should take place, but in foro externo, that is, to putting them in act, not always. So what Hobbes is trying to say here is that we always have a reason to want these laws of nature to be in place, to be in effect. But it's not the case that we always have reason to actually follow those laws because, again, there's no obligation to be a sucker. If we don't know that whether other people are going to follow them or not, then we don't have the obligation to follow them ourselves. So another way of putting this is that peace poses a collective action problem. It's hard for any individual to bring about, well, each individual can't bring about peace himself. He needs the agreement of others, but it's difficult for people to make these agreements work because there's always a fear of defection. We're always concerned that someone might, be more interested in short-term gain, or they're more interested in glory, or what have you, and they're not really focusing on the goods of peace in the long run. And so if we put ourselves in a situation where we're in danger of getting stabbed in the back, well, obviously we don't want to get into that situation. So Hobbes tells us the dictates of reason men used to call by the name of laws, but improperly, for they are but conclusions, or theorems concerning what conduceth to the conservation and defense of themselves, whereas law properly is the word of him that by right hath command over others. So interestingly, after spending 2 chapters telling you what the laws of nature are, at the end of chapter 15, Hobbes backs off a bit and says, really these aren't laws. That's what everyone's called them. I'm talking about the same thing they're talking about what these, in content, what these laws of nature are, but really they're just, they're like theorems. They're rules that would tell you, if they were followed, what would conduce to peace, what would conduce to the conservation of all. But in the strict sense, Hobbes thinks, law is the will of the authority. He says, law is the word of him that by right hath command over others. So Hobbes ultimately has a command theory of authority. It's not, so for Aristotle, law is fundamentally this ordinance of reason that promotes the common good. Again, Hobbes has a picture that's kind of similar to that in some ways. Yes, there are these rules that promote the common good. We all have reason to follow those laws if everyone else is following them, because that'll promote our individual good. But those aren't, strictly speaking, laws until they've been put in place by someone who has command over others. One other thing to highlight about the way Hobbes is thinking about laws of nature here and how it differs from the Aristotelian tradition culminating in Thomas Aquinas is the relationship between the individual good and the common good. For the Aristotelian, including Thomas Aquinas, the individual good is bound up with the common good. So it's not that we seek the common good for our own individual good, or that neither one is really prior to the other, or in some sense Aristotle thinks that the good of the community is what's known first, but the two are organically related. That's not the case with Hobbes. For Hobbes, we clearly have an interest in preserving our own lives. That's what's fundamental. The good of the community is just of instrumental importance. It's not that, in order to lead a good life, we need to be engaging in valuable activities that can only be pursued in a community. That's not the way that Hobbes is thinking about it. He thinks about the good of the community as primarily being instrumental to the good of the individual. one other question that arises in connection to laws of nature and contracts is, why should someone honor their contracts? That is, in a case where you don't have to worry about the other party fulfilling their part of the agreement, so there's not an assurance problem, why exactly should you go ahead and perform your side of the bargain? Why shouldn't you take advantage of others? Hobbes has kind of suggested that you shouldn't, but in chapter 15 he does try to answer the question as to why shouldn't you break your contracts whenever it would be beneficial to you. And so this is his famous passage where he says, the fool hath said in his heart that there is no such thing as justice. So why is the fool wrong? Why is the fool wrong to think that whenever it would be beneficial to him to dishonor his word, to break a contract, why shouldn't he actually do so? And so what Hobbes says is that the fool, that is, he that breaketh his covenant, and consequently declareth that he thinks he may with reason do so, cannot be received into any society, and therefore if he be left or cast out of society, he perisheth. Sort of a tongue twister there. So ultimately Hobbes is saying that the fool, he's precisely a fool because he doesn't really understand his long-term best interests. He's going after short-term gain rather than taking a long view of his situation. Someone who breaks his word is going to be known as an oath breaker. He's going to be known that he's someone that can't be trusted. And so he's not going to be someone who's received into society. People are going to want to cast him out of society because he's not someone who can be relied on. And then being excluded from society, then he's not going to be able to preserve his own life. So that's ultimately the explanation for Hobbes as to why we ought to honor our contracts. Again, it comes down to self-interest. It's enlightened self-interest. It's looking at things in the long run, but it's not ultimately a concern with other people or a concern with any kind of exalted notion of the good. It's, what would we do? What should you do so that people trust you, so that you're not excluded from society? So to review then the main themes in Hobbes' discussion about the laws of nature. The laws of nature, or just another way of thinking about it, is morality, or especially social morality. This rests on is limited by individuals' interest in self-preservation. So each individual's interest in self-preservation, that's the basis of the moral law. And achieving peace is a collective action problem. We all want peace, but nobody can bring about peace on his own. And in fact, it's difficult collectively to bring about peace because we always have reason to fear that some individuals are going to defect. So that's it for today. Next time we're going to pick up with Hobbes' solution to this collective action problem. That is, he's going to argue that we need to institute a common power, a state, an enforcement agency that's going to enforce the contracts that we would make, that's going to enforce morality, as it were. So that's going to ultimately be the way out of the state of nature. So we'll take a closer look at that next time, as well as the actual character of the political institutions that Hobbes thinks are necessary to perform that role.